It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of political and parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by correspondents in Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our correspondent, David Cornock. This week...
The idea in a nutshell is that you will find talent, genius, flair, imagination, enthusiasm everywhere in this country, all of them evenly distributed, but opportunity is not.
At Tory conference, the Prime Minister tries to define levelling up. The Chancellor, who's hiked up taxes, says this.
Yes, I want tax cuts, but in order to do that, our public finances must be put back on a sustainable footing.
And clearly we still have a member who's desperately trying to get into Zoom but cannot get into...
No, Darren Miller, we are holding the vote, please.
In the Welsh Parliament, a key policy goes through after a member fails to vote remotely. And technical problems in Scotland too, with the vaccine passport app.
I am, of course, well aware that many people found it extremely difficult to use the app initially. I apologise for that.
So, there's no Commons or Lords sitting at the moment. Last week we gave you highlights of the Labour conference. This week it was the Conservatives' turn. David, we saw Boris Johnson's first speech to a full conference hall as Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. What did you make of it?
It looked very much like a victory speech, didn't it? And that is really because that's what it was, his first speech since the general election victory 2 years ago. Very much a sort of celebration lap, really, among the Conservative Party activists. It was a very typical Boris Johnson speech, lots of upbeat, optimistic, flowery language, lots of reasons to be cheerful. But he also used it to sketch out his vision, really, of what the British economy should look like post-Brexit, post-economy. And he talked about a change of direction from what he called the decades of drift and dither under his predecessors. That, of course, is his vision for the future. The here and now, for many people, is not like that at all, because you have soaring energy prices for many families and businesses. You have this week £20 a week taken away from some of the poorest families in universal credit. And of course, you still have those labour shortages that mean, for example, some people can't fill up at the pumps. Now, his argument is that these are stresses and strains reflecting a revival and growth in the economy and a transformation really to the promised land of a high-wage, high-skilled economy. But he did concede that this could take time and could be difficult at times. Let's have a listen to how he explained his argument to the party activists in Manchester.
Isn't it amazing to be back here in person? And the first time since so many of you worked to defy the sceptics by winning councils and communities that Conservatives have never won in before, such as Hartlepool. And in fact, it's the first time since the general election of 2019 when we finally sent that core-droid communist cosmonaut into orbit where he belongs. We have a huge hole in the public finances. We spent £407 billion on COVID support, and our debt now stands at over £2 trillion. Does anyone seriously imagine that we should not now be raising the funding to sort this out? Is that really the view of responsible Conservatives? I can tell you something. Margaret Thatcher would not have ignored the meteorite that has just crashed through the public finances. She would have wagged her finger and said, more borrowing now is just higher interest rates and even higher taxes later. We have unemployment 2 million lower than forecast. We have demand surging. And I'm pleased to say that after years of stagnation, more than a decade, wages are going up faster than before the pandemic began. And that matters deeply because we are embarking now on a change of direction that has been long overdue in the UK economy. We're not going back to the same old broken model with low wages, low growth, low skills, and low productivity, all of it enabled and assisted by uncontrolled immigration. And to level up, on top of the extra 14 billion we're putting into education, on top of the increase that means every teacher starts with a salary of £30,000, we're announcing today a levelling up premium of up to £3,000 to send the best maths and science teachers to the places that need them most. And above all, we are investing. And if you insist on the economic theory behind levelling up, it is contained in the insight of Vilfredo Pareto, a 19th century Italian figure who floated from the cobwebbed attic of my memories. There are all kinds of improvements that you can make to people's lives, he said, without diminishing everyone else. Rishi will, I'm sure, confirm this. We call these Pareto improvements, right? And they are the means of levelling up. And the idea in a nutshell is that you will find talent, genius, flair, imagination, enthusiasm everywhere in this country, all of them evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. And it is our mission as Conservatives to promote opportunity with every tool we have. We attack and deny our history at our peril. And when they began to attack Churchill as a racist, I was minded to ignore them. Because it's only 20 years ago since BBC audiences overwhelmingly voted him the greatest Briton of all time. Because he helped to defeat a regime, after all. He helped to defeat a regime, after all, that was defined by one of the most vicious racisms the world has ever seen. But as time has gone by, it's become clear to me that this isn't just a joke. They really do want to rewrite our national story, starting with Hereward the Woke. We really are at risk of a kind of know-nothing cancel culture iconoclasm. And so we Conservatives will defend our history and cultural inheritance, not because we're proud. Not because we're proud of everything, but because trying to edit it now is as dishonest as a celebrity trying furtively to change his entry in Wikipedia. And it's a betrayal of our children's education, to be a trailblazer, to judge people not by where they come from, but by their spirit and by what is inside them. That is the spirit that is the same across this country in every town and village and city that can be found in the hearts and minds of kids growing up everywhere. And that is the spirit we are going to unleash. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, David. Okay, right, here we go.
Well, that was some of what Boris Johnson had to say at the party conference this week. David, was there very much in the way of policy?
The big idea of the week, Alex, was levelling up. And we heard Boris Johnson try to explain what it means in practice there, because it's not always clear. We do now, of course, have a Secretary of State for levelling up in Michael Gove. He offered his own definition, and that is being able to live your best life. That's what levelling up means. As for the policies, well, you heard Boris Johnson there talk about this levelling up premium for teachers. And what that means is that if you're a recently qualified teacher in maths or science and you go to work in a deprived area of England, you will get some extra money to teach in that particular area. Now, that idea has been widely welcomed both by unions and other politicians. Fair to point out, though, it does look very familiar to an idea the Conservatives had a few years ago, which they decided to scrap not so long ago.
Now, of course, it was party conference, and so we heard from Rishi Sunak. And given that his job title is Chancellor, as you might expect, he was focusing on tax and public finances.
Yeah, this is the Chancellor who's been signing those huge cheques over the last 18 months during the pandemic. Also, the Chancellor, of course, who now has to try and pay for all that money that's been spent on the pandemic. And we know he's going to do that by putting taxes up to the highest tax burden the UK has seen since 1949. Now, that could be a little bit awkward trying to sell that to a Conservative conference where activists believe they are a low tax party, and they want him to cut taxes rather than raise them. But he was defiant. He explained why there was a need to put up taxes. He said it was better than borrowing, but he did sort of leave out the prospect that one day in the not too distant future he'd quite like to cut taxes too.
There can be no prosperous future unless it is built on the foundation of strong public finances. I have to be blunt with you. Our recovery comes with a cost. Our national debt is almost 100% of GDP, so we need to fix our public finances. Because strong public finances don't happen by accident. They are a deliberate choice. They are a legacy for future generations and a safeguard against future threats. I'm grateful. We should all be grateful to my predecessors and their 10 years of sound Conservative management of our economy. They believed in fiscal responsibility. I believe in fiscal responsibility, and everyone in this hall does too. And whilst I know tax rises are unpopular, some will even say unconservative, I'll tell you what is unconservative. Unfunded pledges, reckless borrowing and soaring debt. Anyone who tells you that you can borrow more today and tomorrow will simply sort itself out just doesn't care about the future. So yes, I want tax cuts, but in order to do that, our public finances must be put back on a sustainable footing.
Rishi Sunak addressing the Conservative Party conference. And David, it was, of course, a week of speeches from cabinet ministers, among them the Home Secretary Priti Patel. What did she have to say? Yeah, and Priti Patel is always popular with Conservative activists, and indeed a Home Secretary speech to a Conservative Party conference is always a bit of a draw. The crowd does tend to fill up in the conference hall for that. Now, as you'd expect, there was a focus on law and order. She talked about a crackdown on environmental activists who've disrupted motorways, got cheers for that and long applause. What was less expected, I think, was what she had to say about the Metropolitan Police in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer. Now, she's announced an inquiry that'll look in two parts. Firstly, at how that killer was still able to work as a serving police officer despite concerns about his behaviour. And secondly, it's going to look more widely, look at police vetting practices. So I think that is going to be certainly one to watch. Here's how she explained it to the conference.
All our thoughts remain with Sarah Everard's family and friends. Her murderer, whose name I will not repeat, was a monster. His explicit intention was to instill fear and terror into women and girls. I say this as Home Secretary, but also as a woman, that such unconscionable crimes and acts of violence against women and girls have no place in our society. It is abhorrent that a serving police officer was able to abuse his position of power, authority and trust to commit such a horrific crime. The public have a right to know what systematic failures enabled his continued employment as a police officer. We need answers as to why this was allowed to happen. I can confirm today that there will be an inquiry to give the independent oversight needed to ensure that something like this can never happen again.
Priti Patel there, and we will be back with David later for more on the Conservative Party conference. But for now, let's go to the Welsh Parliament and speak to our reporter there, Cemlyn Davies. Cemlyn, there were some extraordinary scenes in the Welsh Parliament this week during that crunch vote on COVID passes. Talk us through what happened.
Yeah, that's right. Real drama here on Tuesday night. And ahead of the debate on introducing COVID passes, well, all eyes were on Plaid Cymru because Labour, remember, don't have a majority here in the Senedd. They have exactly half the seats. We knew already that the Conservatives were against COVID passes, so too the only Liberal Democrat member. So it seemed that Labour would need Plaid's backing to get this through. Throughout the day, Plaid MSs were being particularly tight-lipped, so it wasn't until the debate actually began that we found out how Plaid would be voting on this.
We've asked many questions and haven't been given the assurances that we have sought, and it's for that reason that we feel unable to support these regulations today. And in voting against, I want to emphasise that this isn't, this isn't because of issues of principle. We asked Welsh Government to withdraw this motion, made it clear we'd contribute to discussions on how something more robust actually could be brought forward, better evidenced and with clarity on implication. And that offer is still genuinely open.
I feel quite strongly about this, but I just do not think that we should become a checkpoint society by introducing a vaccine passport.
We fully understand that businesses want to remain open, and this measure will help us to do that throughout the winter. And let me be clear, not supporting this measure today will be an act of gross irresponsibility when it comes to public health in Wales.
So at that point, with the debate drawing to a close, it seemed that we were heading for a tied vote, which would mean that these proposals for COVID passes would fall. But then, when the vote took place and the result was announced, well, the Welsh Government won by 28 votes to 27.
So, Cemlyn, can you tell us a little bit more about what happened to that missing vote there?
Yes, well, what happened is that the Conservative MS for the Vale of Clwyd, Gareth Davies, failed to vote. He was at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester at the time, and he said that because of technical difficulties or IT challenges, as he described them, he wasn't able to log on in time to vote. Now, he said he was deeply upset, frustrated and angry that he hadn't been able to take part. Now, Mr Davies had hoped to be able to make a more personal statement to the Senedd on Wednesday. That request was rejected by Elin Jones, the Llywydd, or presiding officer. She said that he'd already released a statement to the media, but she did take the opportunity to make her own statement.
I'll take the opportunity, however, to reiterate to all members that it is every individual member's responsibility to ensure they are present early enough and in time to vote, wherever you may be, and especially if voting from a location for the first time.
Well, the idea of COVID passes is clearly controversial, and after the vote here on Tuesday night, some MSs weren't able to leave their offices because of protests taking part outside. Representatives of the nightclub industry also described events here as a shambles and called for a re-vote. That won't happen, and so the upshot of all this, of course, is that from Monday, anybody in Wales over 18 years old wanting to attend certain large-scale events or nightclubs will have to either show that they've had 2 COVID jabs or that they've had a negative lateral flow test in the previous 48 hours.
OK, so pretty controversial what happened over the COVID passes. And I think there's also been a row this week about nurses' pay.
Yes, that's right. Now, the Welsh Government has committed to a 3% pay rise for all NHS staff in Wales. Nurses' unions have rejected that, and Plaid Cymru were making the argument this week that 3% equates to a real terms pay cut, and they want to see nurses being offered more money.
Research, I'm incredible that I'm being heckled by Labour members when I'm making the case for NHS workers. Research last year suggested a third of nurses are considering leaving the NHS with the majority citing pay. There are already 1,600 vacancies in the NHS in Wales. After the year that they've had, how will a 3% pay increase convince those that remain to stay when even a Labour government imposes a below-inflation pay award on nurses? Can you really blame them when NHS staff feel let down, undervalued and ignored?
I see a list of questions on the order paper today, many from members of his own group, who will no doubt be urging me to spend more money on different aspects of the health service. More money. Yet if I was to follow his advice, we would have less money to do the things that they would ask us to do, because there is a fixed sum of money available. And if more of it goes into pay, there is less of it to provide a service.
Mark Drakeford there. The First Minister did say, though, that negotiations are continuing over this pay offer.
Camden, we've also had some news this week about the leader of the Welsh Conservatives, yes?
Yes, Andrew Davies. Now, he hasn't been around in the Senedd for the past couple of weeks because of ill health. He wasn't well enough to attend the Conservative Party conference either. And then yesterday, he released a statement saying that he's had flu and coronavirus and that it's all knocked him for six, he says, and had an impact on his mental well-being. And so, on doctor's orders, he says he's taking a complete break from work to give him time, he says, to fully bounce back.
OK, Camden, thank you so much for bringing us up to date. Now, let's go to Holyrood now and our reporter Jenny Davidson. Jenny, hello there. We've talked a lot on this programme about the Scottish Government's vaccine passports policy, and there have been some technical problems with that.
That's right. The vaccine passport scheme was already mired in controversy, but that's increased this week with the launch of the app. Now, the app only launched last Thursday, just 12 hours before the vaccine passport checks were due to come in on Friday, and it has been beset by problems in the first few days. The idea was that people could use their passport or their driving licence to verify their identity, and they could create a QR code, but there's been numerous reports of problems, from being unable to download the app or being thrown out at various stages of the process, or not being able to access vaccine records despite entering the right information. At a COVID update on Tuesday, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, apologised for problems with the app launch.
I am, of course, well aware that many people found it extremely difficult to use the app initially. In particular, many found that the app was unable to locate their vaccination record from the information that they had provided. This problem was especially acute over Thursday evening and Friday. I know this caused extreme frustration for users who wanted to download the app as quickly as possible, and also for businesses and events organisers who were planning to test their certification arrangements over the weekend, and I apologise for that. The problem was not with the app itself, but with the NHS systems that it links to.
And as the First Minister's statement just about acknowledges, it wasn't just about demand. There was an error with their system. Now she talks of a new approach, the 4 E's. First Minister, we don't need 4 E's to describe this scheme. We only need one: embarrassment. A complete and utter embarrassment. So can the First Minister tell us, when the Scottish Government paid £600,000 of taxpayers' money to a Danish app developer, how many people were expected to try and download the app? Can the First Minister tell us how many people tried and failed to download the app? And to return to the same question I asked just hours before the scheme went live last week, will the First Minister now accept that the scheme wasn't ready to be launched and should have been delayed? And is it about time she listened to businesses and scrapped it altogether?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon has said that the initial problems with the app have now been resolved. The scheme is going ahead, the vaccine passport scheme, and enforcement will take place from 18th of October. But opposition parties are going to continue to call for this to be scrapped. So this controversy is something that's likely to continue in the coming weeks.
I'm sure it's something that we will come back to as well, Jenny. But separately, there was an important ruling from the Supreme Court that was debated in Holyrood this week as well.
That's right. It was a ruling on 2 bills that were passed by the Scottish Parliament in March. Now, the UK government believed that both bills were out with the competence, out with the powers of the Scottish Parliament, and it took a challenge to the Supreme Court. Now, both bills were about incorporating international treaties into Scots law. One was a government bill on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The other was a member's bill about local government powers. And it's actually interesting, it wasn't the substance of the bill that was the issues, actually. Both bills were passed unanimously by all parties in the Scottish Parliament. They've got widespread backing. It was purely an issue of whether the Parliament had the power to pass these bills as they stand, and the Supreme Court said it didn't. The issue related really to the powers within the bills of Scottish courts to override UK legislation, so that would be Westminster legislation, effectively limiting the power of Westminster to make laws in Scotland, and that was what was considered out of bounds of the Scottish Parliament. So they're going to be returned and they have to be amended. Now, the reaction to this was quite mixed. The Scottish Government, the Greens, talked about the limits of the powers of devolution and the issues this was causing, particularly in terms of passing an important piece of legislation about children's rights. Whereas the Scottish Conservatives talked about this as a manufactured grievance that had been produced ahead of the election, and Labour and the Lib Dems took issue with the time that had been given over to resolving this, when the bills could have been brought in within the powers of the Scottish Parliament in the first place.
Presiding Officer, while we fully respect the Court's judgment and will abide by the ruling, we cannot help but be bitterly disappointed. It makes plain that we are constitutionally prohibited from enacting legislation that this Parliament unanimously decided was necessary to enshrine and fully protect the rights of our children. Some have said that the Scottish Parliament is the most powerful devolved legislature in the world. On the day that the Supreme Court has confirmed boundaries on our ability to protect our children, I regret to say it certainly does not feel anything like that.
We welcome this legal judgment because this was always a legal question. It was never about the substance of the policy. There was unanimous support from all parties in this chamber for both bills. But we warned that parts of the bill would be legally problematic. To their shame, the SNP did not listen and instead politicised this from the very beginning. In this very chamber, at stage 3 of the bill, the Deputy First Minister characterised the UK government's approach as menacing. In an election debate, Nicola Sturgeon used it to attack the UK government and described the legal challenge on Twitter as morally repugnant. That political posturing has been comprehensively demolished by the definitive judgment of the Supreme Court today.
Well, this isn't the end of the road for the 2 bills. As I mentioned already, they're going to be returned to the Scottish Parliament. And this is actually the first time in the Scottish Parliament's history this has happened. They'll be reworked and then they can be passed within the powers of the Scottish Parliament. But the ongoing issue, and this is going to feed into a certain grievance with the Scottish Government about Westminster's involvement in devolved areas and about the limits of devolved powers.
OK, Jenny, I did want to ask you about something that came up at First Minister's questions this week. The issue of deaths linked to hospital infections was raised. Can you tell us what was said?
Yes, well, Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar challenged the First Minister to do more and to take more responsibility about deaths that have been linked to infections at Glasgow's Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. It's an issue he's taken a particular personal interest in, and he's raised it on a number of occasions before. In this case, he was talking about the deaths of 2 children that have been confirmed by a case review as having died, at least partly as a result of hospital-acquired infections. Now, one of them, Millie Maid, her mum, Kimberly Darroch, has spoken to the press a lot. The other child had not been identified. So this was what Anna Sarwar is raising here.
It shouldn't take a family having to campaign in a newspaper in order to get a child's death investigated. That's fundamentally what's happened here. The reason why Millie Main's death is being investigated is because of the bravery of Kimberly Darroch to go onto the television and speak in a newspaper about what happened to her daughter. The other family doesn't have the opportunity to do that because they don't know what happened to their child. That cannot be a reason not to have a criminal investigation into that child's death. Nicola Sturgeon was Health Secretary when the hospital was commissioned. She was First Minister when the hospital was opened and has been in charge throughout this scandal. Surely there must come a point when it stops being whistleblowers, families and campaigners taking on the state in order to get answers, and instead the state takes the side of the whistleblowers, families and campaigners to find the answers and get justice. Because we can't wait for the outcome of the public inquiry for families to get justice. That could take years. Words of sympathy from the First Minister are frankly wearing thin. What is it going to take for Nicola Sturgeon to take responsibility, own this crisis, get a grip of this rotten health board and get the families the truth and the justice they deserve?
It's not credible for Anas Sarwar to say that a public inquiry was fought for and campaigned for, and I accept that, although the government did establish the public inquiry, and then in the next breath just to say, well, it doesn't matter, we can't wait for that, we have to somehow do something different. This is an independent statutory public inquiry. Those who have a genuine interest in getting to the answers and the truth now, I think, have a duty to allow that inquiry to properly do its work.
As was mentioned in the clip, there is a public inquiry underway at the moment into these hospital deaths, so it's unlikely we're going to get more detail, but probably we'll find out more and we'll get more answers as that inquiry progresses.
OK, Jenny, thank you very much. Jenny Davison there in Holyrood. Now, David is still with me here in the studio, and we can talk a little bit more about the Conservative Party conference and that speech from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. David, he was very keen to set out how his long-term hopes for Brexit might change the country, but there is still an issue with a part of the deal that covers Northern Ireland, and that is very much something that is in the here and now that did come up at the conference.
Absolutely. We may have left the EU, but 5 years on, Brexit is very much still with us as a political issue. David Frost, Lord Frost, the Brexit minister, used his speech to argue that what's known as the Northern Ireland Protocol isn't working and needs to change. Fair to point out that, of course, it was Lord Frost who negotiated that deal, something he does accept. Now, it was designed to ensure that there were no checks along the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but in practice, it's made it harder to export some goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And Lord Frost, in his speech, put the EU on notice that unless things change, the UK is prepared to trigger unilaterally what's known in the jargon as Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol.
If we can agree something better, as I would like us to do, we can get back to where we want it to be. An independent Britain with friendly relations with the EU based on free trade. But we cannot wait forever. Without an agreed solution soon, we will need to act using the Article 16 safeguard mechanism to address the impact the protocol is having in Northern Ireland.
Now, we are expecting an official EU response to that speech and the paper that the UK has put forward to Brussels. We're expecting that within the next few days. Fair to say UK ministers do remain under pressure on this, and the Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, was put on the spot at the conference itself by the former First Minister and DUP leader, Arlene Foster.
We heard from Lord Frost this morning, very clearly what he thinks about what needs to be done. You have already said, and you said it yesterday, that you think the conditions are there to trigger Article 16. I suppose, putting on my Northern Ireland hat, I would say, what are we waiting for?
We do think that the conditions have been met to trigger Article 16. We made that point when we launched the command paper back in July. But what we're also saying, and we're very clear about this, the reason we have not yet triggered Article 16, and it doesn't mean we won't. If we need to, we will. But what we want to do is negotiate a solution that is binding and sustainable. The current structure of the protocol is not sustainable.
OK, that's it for now from David. But the protocol was also a big issue at Stormont this week. Our correspondent Jane McCormack is there and can join us now. Jane, there was a debate this week between Unionist politicians on how to handle the Northern Ireland Protocol. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
That's right, Alex, quite the spat between the DUP and the smaller traditional unionist voice party here. Now, the unionist parties at Stormont all agree that they want the protocol scrapped, but they don't quite agree on how that should happen. And the TUV for some time has been calling, as part of its rally against the protocol, for the DUP's Agriculture Minister Edwin Poots to immediately stop implementing the checks on goods arriving at Northern Ireland's ports. And its leader, Jim Allister, wasn't shy of saying so again this week, and he also accused the DUP of being powerless when it comes to the protocol.
Doesn't it demonstrate both the tyranny of the protocol and his folly in respect of something he could do something about, namely continuing to implement the checks which keep the iniquitous protocol alive?
I would remind the member that this is Westminster policy, not Northern Ireland executive policy. This is Westminster policy, which has been imposed upon Northern Ireland. And the member knows this very well because the member tested it in court and he lost his case. And I would also remind the member that we are not going to win this battle by going on the streets, by violence or anything else. We will win this battle by good politics.
Alex, what Edwin Poots means by good politics is, I suppose, up for debate. His party has already warned that it will withdraw its ministers from Stormont if there are not significant changes to the protocol by sometime next month. You already mentioned those hints from the Brexit Minister, Lord Frost, about threatening to use Article 16 if the EU doesn't make enough compromises. Now, that might be enough to satisfy the DUP from holding off on suspending these institutions here. What we do know for certain is that November looks set to be a pretty interesting month.
And Jane, I think there was condemnation from all sides about death threats that were made against the Health Minister.
That's right. Robin Swan, the Health Minister, he effectively has been the face of managing coronavirus restrictions in Northern Ireland and the vaccine rollout. He has faced threats throughout the course of the pandemic, but recently he revealed that he has had to review his personal security arrangements again after more threats against him. Now, there was a debate on COVID restrictions in the Chamber. The DUP used that to raise this issue about what Robin Swan has been facing. However, during that, there was a pretty robust response from the Minister.
It is absolutely wrong to threaten any public representative from no matter what party or hue you come from, no matter what policy you exact, no matter what your political spectrum or belief is. It is wrong, totally wrong, to threaten any... Yes, sir, I'll give it.
Would the member also agree then it is also wrong to set up dog whistles that actually signal to other people within the community that it is all right to make those attacks, and either by their silence or their neglect and public condemnation that actually gives those people an authority, or they think they have an authority, either through social media or otherwise, where they think it is okay to either enact those threats or those abuses, or actually engender those protests that we've seen outside our vaccination centres as well.
Robin Swan there, Alex, getting at the fact that he has been accused by some DUP politicians at times of scaremongering over COVID, and I think he was perhaps hinting to those in the DUP that their silence over some of those criticisms has maybe indirectly influenced some of the harsher vitriol against him, but obviously that is something that the DUP would say they totally reject.
OK, Jane, I want to ask you about one issue that's been raised across the United Kingdom and in Northern Ireland, and that's the end of the £20 a week uplift to universal credit, which started to really affect people from this week. That was put in place at the start of the pandemic. Tell us what members have been saying about it.
Obviously, there's been an awful lot of criticism against the government in Westminster for withdrawing the uplift. We've heard stories of how difficult it is going to be for people who will be affected by this. Now, apart from calling on Westminster to reverse the cut, there isn't an awful lot that Stormont can do unless it wants to make up the shortfall itself, and we know that that would cost roughly about £110 million per year for them to do that. Now, the SDLP led a debate in the Assembly this week calling on Sinn Féin's Communities Minister Deirdre Hargey to find the money to do it, but as you will see in this exchange, she was making it pretty clear that if somebody pays for it, it might have to come from somebody else's budget, and that might be pretty difficult when it comes to making those decisions about who loses out.
This uplift
was not and is not a luxury. It's not yet another payment for scroungers, a characterisation which I've seen bandied around on social media and indeed by senior Tory politicians in recent weeks.
We have to be open and honest about our abilities to mitigate, yet again, another cut by the Tories. The budget here in the North is not infinite, and people know the circumstances of how we get the money through a block grant. Our fiscal powers and levers are also restricted, and we obviously do need a further conversation on how we can transfer more powers from Westminster to the Assembly here. But in the interim, I would be interested in hearing from the SDLP who are proposing the motion, but also from others around how we propose to find this additional money. Which minister's budget? Is it their own minister's budget that's going to give up the money in order to retain this?
Alex, you won't find any party here in Northern Ireland that doesn't want to see a continuation in this uplift of universal credit, but you also won't find any minister at Stormont who's willing to take a cut within their own department's budget in order to pay for it. So I think this is going to be something that causes consternation for some time to come.
I suspect you're right, Jane. Thank you very much. Now, David is still here. And David, I think we've got time to ask about one more of those conference speeches. And it's a guy who's relatively new to his job, if we can say that, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid. What did he have to say?
Yeah, an experienced Cabinet Minister, but new as Health Secretary, only a few months since he took over from Matt Hancock. And of course, in that role, he's now inherited this massive treatment backlog, 6 million people on waiting lists. He told the conference it could go as much to as high as 13 million. It could get worse before it gets better. Now, he's got more money to deal with that, but of course he wants to make sure it's spent wisely and spent effectively. So he has announced a review of leadership and management within the NHS. And he also gave the conference this personal insight, really, into his philosophy in tackling his new job.
The state was needed in this pandemic more than any time in peacetime. But government shouldn't own all risks and responsibilities in life. We as citizens have to take some responsibility for our health too. We should always go first to the state. What kind of society would that be? Health and social care. It begins at home. It should be family first, then community, then the state. If you do need support, we're lucky we live in a compassionate society in a developed country that can afford to help you. There are few higher callings for anyone than to care for another person. I've asked retired General Sir Gordon Messenger to lead a review of leadership and management in health and social care. This will be the most far-reaching review since Roy Griffiths' report to Margaret Thatcher in 1983. It will shine a light on the outstanding leaders who can drive efficiency and innovation, and it will see how we can replicate that leadership throughout the country.
Sajid Javid there at the Conservative Party conference. David, we did hear quite a lot about the visions of some of the Cabinet Ministers through the Conservative Party conference season. But of course, we have got some fairly big policy events coming up in Parliament in the next few weeks. Just talk us through those.
Yes, that may be why it was quite an unusual party conference. Normally, when a governing party meets either in Manchester or by the seaside, it comes complete with a slew of announcements, a cavalcade that we get every day. It wasn't quite like that in Manchester. And that may be because at the end of this month, the end of October, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak is announcing not just a budget, but also a spending review. So setting out the government's priorities, what it's going to spend money on, and of course, importantly, how it's going to raise that money from you, me and other taxpayers across the UK. So you can sense the argument still going on ahead of that budget and spending review.
OK, of course, we will be watching both of those very closely, but that is it for today. Joe will be back with Politics Live on Monday and next Friday with more Politics UK.